What if I told you that America's inflation crisis isn't just hurting households? It's quietly funding China's next phase of dominance. And what if the very price increases frustrating consumers across the United States are being converted into strategic leverage overseas? That sounds dramatic. But stay with me, because the numbers tell a story most analysts refuse to confront. Most people think inflation is a domestic problem: too much stimulus, supply chain shocks, energy prices. But here's what's really happening: inflation is redistributing global power. And if you want to understand how China is turning American inflation into an export advantage, you need to see the three systems operating beneath the headlines. System 1 is currency divergence. System 2 is industrial cost asymmetry. System 3 is strategic supply chain positioning. Here's what mainstream commentary gets wrong: they treat inflation as a temporary spike. But this is the inflation arbitrage era, and it's not symmetrical. Let me show you the numbers that matter. In June 2022, US CPI inflation peaked at 9.1%. That wasn't 9%, it was 9.1%, the highest level in 40 years. Meanwhile, China's inflation that year hovered around 2.0%, and in some months dipped below 1.0%. This is the part that should surprise you. While American consumers were paying dramatically more, Chinese producers were operating in a low inflation environment. Why does that matter? Because inflation forces central banks to react. The Federal Reserve raised interest rates from near zero to over 5.25% in just 16 months. Aggressive tightening strengthened the US dollar. On the surface, a strong dollar sounds like strength. But here's the paradox: the weapon that was supposed to create stability became a pricing distortion tool. When I spoke with a senior trade analyst last year, he told me off the record, the dollar surge is doing half of China's export work for them. That statement stuck with me, because once the dollar appreciates, American buyers can import more goods per dollar, especially from countries where domestic inflation is low. Here's what matters: inflation in the United States raises domestic production costs, wages, energy, financing. But a stronger dollar simultaneously makes foreign goods relatively cheaper. So American manufacturers face rising costs while Chinese exporters benefit from stable input prices and favorable currency conversion. Is that accidental or structural? Let's break down System 1, currency divergence. As US rates climbed above 5%, capital flowed into dollar-denominated assets. The dollar index surged to levels not seen in 2 decades. Meanwhile, China maintained comparatively accommodative monetary policy. The yuan weakened modestly. That widening gap created a trade pricing wedge. Most people think higher US rates hurt China, but here's what's really happening: a stronger dollar makes Chinese goods cheaper for American importers, even if Chinese factory prices remain flat. The exchange rate becomes a silent subsidy. If you want to understand global trade power, just look at pricing elasticity. When the dollar strengthens 10% against a trade partner's currency, import prices effectively drop without the exporter cutting margins. That's powerful. I talked to factory managers in Shenzhen who told me something fascinating. Orders from US buyers didn't collapse during inflation. In many sectors, they stabilized faster than expected. Why? Because when domestic alternatives became more expensive, import substitution reversed. This connects to something even bigger, and I'll show you in a minute. Here's the uncomfortable truth: inflation punishes consumers immediately, but it rewards exporters strategically. While American households absorbed higher food, rent, and energy costs, Chinese manufacturers operated under cost containment. Producer price inflation in China actually turned negative in 2023. Negative. Think about that contrast. One system tightening aggressively, the other cushioning production. This is the inflation conversion effect. High US inflation forces tightening. Tightening strengthens the dollar. A stronger dollar amplifies import competitiveness. Low Chinese inflation preserves margin stability. That combination isn't coincidence, it's advantage stacking. And we're only on the first layer, because currency divergence alone doesn't explain the scale of export resilience. There's a second mechanism underneath this, one that operates inside factories, logistics corridors, and financing channels. And it's the one that makes most Western analysts completely miss what's actually happening. Let me show you. So here's the second force at work: And this one operates completely differently. If System 1 was about currency divergence, System 2 is about industrial cost asymmetry. And this is where the inflation arbitrage era becomes structural rather than cyclical. Most people think higher inflation just means higher prices everywhere. But here's what's really happening. Inflation doesn't rise evenly across economies. It fractures cost structures. And when cost structures diverge, competitiveness shifts. Let me show you what this actually means. Between 2021 and 2023, average hourly earnings in the United States rose by roughly 14.8% cumulatively. That's not an abstract number. That's payroll pressure on every American manufacturer. Meanwhile, Chinese industrial wage growth during the same period remained far more controlled in the mid-single digits. Here's what nobody tells you. When US companies face wage inflation, energy inflation, and borrowing costs above 5%, their break-even export price jumps. But if Chinese producers face low domestic inflation and access to state-supported financing at lower effective rates, their cost curve stays flatter. That's asymmetry. When I was in Beijing last year, I asked an economist at a policy institute how they viewed US inflation. He smiled and said, "Volatility creates opportunity." That's a mindset difference. In Washington, inflation is a crisis. In Beijing, it's a variable to price around. This is the part that should terrify you. Industrial electricity prices in parts of the United States surged more than 20% during peak inflation periods. Energy is a core input for steel, semiconductors, chemicals, and manufacturing. Meanwhile, China ramped up coal output to stabilize domestic power costs, even as global energy markets tightened. Most people think environmental constraints would cripple that move. But here's what's really happening. Stabilizing industrial energy prices preserved export competitiveness, while others absorbed volatility. Here's what matters. Inflation raises not only wages, but financing costs. U.S. manufacturers refinancing debt in 2023 were doing so at rates often above 6 or even 7%. Compare that with Chinese firms benefiting from policy-directed lending channels designed to support export sectors. That financing gap compounds over time. Stay with me, because what comes next changes everything. Let's look at a real-world example. In 2023, U.S. furniture imports from China rebounded faster than many analysts predicted, despite trade tensions. Why? Because domestic American producers were facing higher lumber prices, elevated labor costs, and expensive credit lines. Chinese exporters, operating in a lower inflation environment, could maintain thinner margins and still undercut domestic alternatives. If you want to understand export power, just look at cost stacking. Wage inflation plus energy inflation plus financing inflation equals price pressure. Remove one or two of those variables, and suddenly your export pricing looks far more attractive. Here's the uncomfortable truth. America's inflation response, aggressive monetary tightening, cools demand domestically. But it doesn't eliminate the need for goods. Retailers still need inventory. Consumers still seek value. And in a high-cost domestic environment, cheaper imports regain appeal. This is the inflation substitution loop. Higher domestic prices push buyers toward lower-cost foreign alternatives. Those alternatives come from economies with stable production costs. That stabilizes their export volumes, which strengthens their trade position. I talked to a supply chain consultant in Singapore who tracks container flows weekly. He told me something striking. During peak US inflation, shipping volumes from major Chinese ports to North America didn't collapse the way many expected. They adjusted, but they didn't implode. Why? Because inflation changed relative pricing, not absolute demand. Let me show you the numbers that matter. In 2023, China's total exports still exceeded $3.3 trillion. That's not a weak export profile. That's resilience under pressure. And part of that resilience came from operating in a lower inflation framework, while competitors were fighting cost spikes. This connects to something even bigger, because currency divergence plus industrial cost asymmetry explains pricing power. But it doesn't explain strategy. It doesn't explain why certain sectors, electric vehicles, solar panels, batteries, are scaling aggressively right now. There's a third system underneath this entire dynamic, and it's the one that transforms temporary inflation gaps into long-term structural advantage. Most people are still debating last year's CPI numbers, but the real question is this: what happens when inflation isn't just endured, but weaponized through supply chain positioning? That's where we're going next. So we've covered currency divergence. We've broken down industrial cost asymmetry. Now we arrive at System 3, and this is where the entire strategy becomes visible. Strategic supply chain positioning. Most people think supply chains are reactive. A factory shuts down, a port gets congested, shipping rates spike. But here's what's really happening. Supply chains are political architecture, and inflation stress tests that architecture. If you want to understand who benefits from inflation, just look at who controls upstream production. Let me show you the numbers that matter. China processes roughly 60 to 70% of the world's lithium, over 70% of rare earth elements, and more than 80% of global solar panel manufacturing capacity. That's not symbolic dominance, that's infrastructure leverage. So when inflation hits downstream markets like the United States, input control becomes pricing power. Here's what nobody tells you. Inflation doesn't just raise prices, it exposes dependency. When I spoke with a battery sector executive in 2023, he admitted something striking. Even as Washington pushed domestic reshoring incentives, American firms still relied heavily on Chinese processed materials. We can't switch overnight, he said. The ecosystem isn't here. That's the supply chain paradox. The country trying to reduce dependency is simultaneously absorbing inflation. Meanwhile, the country at the center of processing capacity operates in a lower inflation environment and scales exports in next-generation industries. This is the part that should surprise you. In 2023, China exported over 1.2 million electric vehicles, a record figure. That's not incremental growth. That's strategic scaling. At the same time, U.S. auto prices remained elevated due to supply bottlenecks, labor negotiations, and higher financing costs for consumers. Here's the uncomfortable truth. Inflation amplifies competitive pressure in emerging industries. When U.S. consumers face auto loan rates above 7%, affordability declines. When manufacturers face higher component costs, domestic scaling slows. Meanwhile, Chinese EV producers benefit from vertically integrated supply chains, batteries, components, assembly, clustered geographically. Most people think tariffs neutralize this, but here's what's really happening. Even with tariffs in place, cost advantages compound across the supply chain. And when inflation drives U.S. prices higher internally, the relative gap can remain significant. This is not about a single product category, solar panels. In 2023, global solar module prices fell nearly 50% in some segments, largely due to Chinese overcapacity and scale efficiencies. That's counterintuitive during a global inflationary period. But it reflects production cost control at origin. Stay with me, because what comes next changes everything. Producer price inflation in China turned negative by mid-2023, hovering around -3% at one point. That means factory gate prices were falling while U.S. consumer prices remained elevated. This is 6 to 8 percentage points of divergence in certain sectors. That spread becomes competitive oxygen. Let me show you what this actually means. When American policymakers focus on domestic inflation reduction, they tighten liquidity. Tightening slows business investment. Slower investment delays industrial expansion. Meanwhile, a lower inflation producer economy can continue scaling output into global markets. Here's what makes people uncomfortable. Inflation is not just an economic variable, it's a strategic filter. It determines who can absorb shocks and who must retrench. I talked to factory supervisors in Shenzhen who described 2023 not as crisis, but as consolidation. We cut margins slightly, one told me, but we increased volume. That's a long game mindset. And here's the numerical reality. Despite trade tensions and slowing global growth, China maintained a trade surplus exceeding $800 billion in 2023. That's not collapse. That's structural positioning. Most people think inflation weakens everyone equally. But here's what's really happening. It redistributes pricing power toward economies with stable production bases and controlled cost inputs. If System 1 was currency leverage and System 2 was cost asymmetry, then System 3 is supply chain entrenchment. And when you combine all three, you don't just get export resilience. You get export amplification. But this raises a bigger question. Is this advantage temporary, tied only to a specific inflation cycle? Or is this the beginning of a deeper shift where inflation volatility in advanced economies becomes a recurring export accelerator for centralized production systems? Let me pull this together. We've walked through three systems: currency divergence, industrial cost asymmetry, and strategic supply chain positioning. Individually, each one explains part of the puzzle. But combined, they form something far more powerful. I call it the inflation conversion framework. Most people think inflation is simply an economic malfunction. But here's what's really happening. Inflation in one major economy can be converted into competitive advantage by another if that second economy maintains cost stability, currency flexibility, and supply chain control. That's the uncomfortable truth. When US inflation peaked at 9.1%, policymakers focused on restoring price stability, and they did bring inflation down significantly. But here's what mainstream analysis gets wrong. The tightening cycle didn't just cool domestic demand, it strengthened the dollar, raised borrowing costs, and increased production expenses. Meanwhile, China operated under a different macro environment: consumer inflation closer to 2%, producer prices turning negative, and policy tools calibrated to stabilize manufacturing. Let me show you what this actually means. A stronger dollar makes imports relatively cheaper. Lower Chinese factory inflation preserves margins. Integrated supply chains enable scaling in strategic sectors like EVs, batteries, and solar. Stack those together and you get export resilience in a period when many predicted collapse. This is $3.3 trillion in annual exports. This is an $800 billion trade surplus. This is over 1.2 million electric vehicles shipped abroad in a single year. These are not abstract metrics. These are structural signals. When I asked a logistics executive in Hong Kong whether inflation was reshaping trade patterns, he didn't hesitate. Volatility rewards scale, he said. That phrase matters because scale absorbs shocks better than fragmentation. Here's what matters. Inflation is not neutral. It penalizes fragmented, high-cost production systems. It favors consolidated, vertically integrated ones. And if you want to understand global power shifts, just look at who controls cost stability during volatility. Now let's talk about the future. Scenario 1, US inflation remains structurally higher than pre-2020 averages, hovering between 3 and 4%. In that case, periodic tightening cycles continue strengthening the dollar intermittently. That sustains the import pricing wedge. China continues converting currency strength into export advantage. Scenario 2, the United States successfully reindustrializes at scale, reducing dependency in critical sectors. That would compress the supply chain advantage. But here's the challenge. Rebuilding ecosystems takes years, not quarters. And capital costs matter. Scenario 3, global inflation volatility becomes the norm. Energy transitions, geopolitical fragmentation, and demographic shifts create recurring price shocks. In that environment, centralized production systems with state-backed coordination may outperform decentralized ones. Which scenario dominates? That depends on policy execution and structural reform. But here's what makes people uncomfortable. Inflation has already demonstrated its geopolitical dimension. It's not just about grocery bills, it's about trade positioning. Most people think inflation weakens economies uniformly. But here's what's really happening. It redistributes leverage toward those prepared to price around it. This is the inflation paradox. The pressure that was supposed to weaken global trade flows instead reinforced the competitiveness of the largest manufacturing base on Earth. And here's my question for you. If inflation cycles continue over the next decade, who benefits more, the economy absorbing rising domestic costs, or the one exporting into that cost environment with relative stability? Stay analytical, stay skeptical. And if you're finding this valuable, hit that like button and subscribe, because we're going deeper into the mechanics of global power shifts. Now I want to hear from you. Do you think America can neutralize this inflation conversion dynamic through reshoring and industrial policy? Or are we entering an era where price volatility itself becomes a strategic advantage for scale-driven exporters? Drop your thoughts in the comments.